Good morning and good afternoon, folks. I'm very happy to be hosting this power session on cracking senior developer roles while working at tech. Right. First of all, thanks a lot for taking time out over this long weekend and joining us over this chat today. Right. Thanks a lot, Vishnu, for joining us. Right. I know it's a late evening for you on a Friday night. I think thanks a lot for taking time out as well. Right. So I think let's get started. Right. So as Loki mentioned, I think today we want to primarily talk about Vishnu's career journey. Right, Vishnu has been in the industry for the last 15 years or so. He has worked with companies like Cisco, Google. Right, so he works as a staff engineer at Google. Right, so he has gone through his career progression across multiple companies. Right, so we thought he could be a best person to talk about how to plan and think about your career. How do we learn and work towards that? Right, so that's kind of the only primary topic of discussion today, right? I think let's kind of start with a quick introduction, right? So as I'll probably go first and then I'll ask Vishnu to introduce himself. So my background, one of the co-founders at Cryo. I done my computer science engineering in BTech. Post that I worked as a developer for close to 4 years. Then I post my MBA, I gone into product management roles. Before starting Cryo, I used to work at Flipkart as senior director, product management, leading their marketplace product. Right, so that's kind of my background. Right, so let's kind of understand a bit more about Vishnu. Why don't you just talk about your career journey so far? Then we'll dive into the discussion points. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, my name is Vishnu. I did my bachelor's in electrical and electronics, and then I did my master's in computer networking, mostly in the US. And I started working in the networking area at companies. I started my career at Cisco. At Cisco, I primarily worked on SDN and focused more on virtual switching. So this is basically a software virtual switch, which is deployed in different hypervisors like VMware, ESX, and Microsoft Hyper-V. And then I went on to work at a startup in kind of the related area, same SDN area. The startup was called Big Switch Networks. Worked there for a couple of years. And then I wanted to try something outside networking, and I joined Google. And at Google, I worked in different areas of infrastructure, starting from with ML infra, and then moving on to most recently data infrastructure. So, yeah, that's kind of my background.
Thanks. I think quite a breadth. I think you moved from almost across the stack, right from system side, networking side of things, and moved up in the kind of application layer as well, right? So I think I've seen your kind of background. I think you've grown in Cisco as well. I think as a senior engineer, then you decided to move on to a different domain, right? I think Google also have gone through the journey of kind of growing within the company, right, across the levels, right? So I think what I want to understand is when somebody joins as a software engineer and they actually look ahead to learn and grow, right? So I think what are the typical skills the team and managers expects for someone to be kind of growing into senior engineer roles? I think what are those broad skill sets, right? I think from expectation perspective, I think it'd be good to understand from you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think when you start out like as a junior software engineer, the expectation around on you is that you can kind of focus on your individual tasks and kind of drive them to completion and do them with good quality and at good time, right? I think that's pretty basic and fundamental. As you move on to more senior roles, the expectation is the complexity of the problem and the scope of the problem kind of increases, and you're given more responsibility, and you're expected to basically drive that from initial kind of prototyping and researching different solutions, figuring out what needs to be done, kind of the scoping and planning of it, and then driving it to completion with very little or no supervision. So that's more at the senior level. And as you grow even more further, the kind of the responsibility increases even more. And you're kind of expected to identify new opportunities for the team, and then drive the entire solution like top down, right? That's at a high level. Those are the kind of the main expectations that the exec team typically has on you.
Got it. I think you've gone through this journey like of kind of in a couple of companies, right? So typically, in a lot of places, let's say if company is growing really fast, there are a lot of opportunities. I think you're also present with a lot of opportunities, right? So, but that's not the case all the time, right? So, could you share some insights or perspectives on how to someone proactively think about picking up the skills, right? Either based on your experience or by seeing some of the friends and colleagues, right? How does someone proactively nudge some towards getting some of the skill sets?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think, I mean, there are, at a high level, you need some direction on what is the area or kind of the core problem space that you're trying to move to, right? From where you are. And for me personally, I think talking to friends or friends of friends who've basically within your network, talking to people who are already working in that area and understanding what it takes, and how do you bridge the gap from where you are to where you want to be. Once I kind of have the lay of the land of what needs to be done, then it's basically a matter of like just sitting through and putting in the hours behind like getting that skill set, whether it's coding or whether it's design in that particular domain. It's basically a matter of doing kind of a set of projects that will teach you the skills through that experience, and then learning them, because you can read as many like kind of books or watch a bunch of videos and things like that, but ultimately when you work on something, that kind of sticks and it's very sticky. It helps you kind of absorb the material much faster. So yeah, that in that way, I think what Cryo is doing is really nice, because kind of gives you that structured introduction to a particular area that you want to upskill to. And this problem, not in the sense that this challenge of kind of taking what you already know and building on it towards a new area, that will always exist in your career, no matter at which stage you are, because the world is constantly changing underneath our feet and we have to keep ourselves updated.
Yeah, I think you went through like a huge change. You were in a core networking area in Cisco and big switch networks, right? So I'm sure the change to Google would have been a lot of change in terms of tech stack and the overall problem space, right? So how did you work towards that? I think you talked about doing projects. I think, did you do projects on your own? Like, how did you make this whatever journey for yourself?
Well, I think initially, I mean, Google, the thing with Google is that, it's a very big company in the sense that there are a lot of areas, right? So I had a networking background. So when I joined Google, I initially joined the networking team. I mean, when I say networking team, that's super big as well. So I kind of started there. And then Google is this amazing place where you can have where you can move to different teams based on how you perform. It gives you that breadth and opportunity. But in terms of what I personally did, I think this is where like starting with what your basis or what your fundamentals are. I had a fundamentally networking background before joining Google. And so the domain in which I joined was networking. But then the interview process and everything, it's like very different at Cisco, for instance. When I had joined, it's a long time back. The interviews were not, as kind of challenging and as Google, for instance, at that time. Maybe things have changed now. So there is a lot of interviews specific stuff that you need to train and do. So in terms of what I did, basically, like, for example, I didn't have like a core CS background before my master's. I had more of like an electrical background. So for me, like getting even the fundamentals, this is even before joining Cisco, right? So getting the fundamentals kind of well done, doing a lot of courses outside my core curriculum. The things that at that time, the material I'd used was stuff from MIT OpenCourseWare. They have a lot of good courses on different areas, and they're all free. And so that has a lot of good material. And so that helped a lot. In terms of projects, I think I primarily, since I did not change domains, I could build on the kind of core work experience that I already had in networking. So that helped in that way. But within Google, I had changed teams in a bunch of areas. And like, for example, from networking, when I'd gone to ML infra, I'd taken a bunch of courses in Coursera on ML, TensorFlow, and stuff like that. So that helped a lot. And that, in course, similar to Cryo, Coursera has a lot of courses where you can do a bunch of projects and build that core skill set. So
got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, good. So I think there's an audience question as well, right? So I think could you just help us visualize kind of your typical week, your current work, right? Like what is the kind of tech stack you work on, and what does your work involve as a staff engineer at Google? I think it'll be good for the audience to visualize that.
Yeah. So right now I'm working in kind of core. So from data infra, I moved back to networking. This time it's networking with respect like the core data center networks that Google has all around the globe. And one of my core responsibilities is thinking about scaling the fabrics in the data center networks to accommodate more workload capacity within one data center. And so that involves scaling up the networks and our control systems, making sure they scale to these to more switches and and routers essentially. So that's kind of my core responsibility.
So
and
like what are the kind of tech stack you work on?
Yeah, so in terms of languages, it's mostly C++.
Got it.
Yeah, and since this is like in lower level net, it's not switching at the switching level, but it's more of like the control system level, and that's all in C++.
Got it.
Yeah.
I think talking more about your experience at Google, right? I think if you were to just talk about an interesting project or a very challenging problem which you kind of enjoyed solving across last 8 years, what would that be?
Yeah, so before, like I said, I was working in data infrastructure, and there, one of the problems I got to work on was building this SQL ETL engine. So if folks are familiar with tools like Spark, for instance, this would be very similar to that. And Google has its own like data parallel processing infrastructure called Flume. You might have heard of things like Cloud Data Flow.
Yeah.
And so SQL ETL is all about taking a SQL query that crunches a large amount of data of the order of several petabytes,
Mhm.
and converting that query into execution plan that you can execute on Flume or Dataflow, and then executing it. So here I got to, and the domain in which this product is used is primarily in generating all the data sets that power up the YouTube data warehouse. And these data sets are used by analysts to answer questions like, what is the journey of one particular user who's like who's watching a bunch of videos, and they want to basically analyze all that activity for a long time horizon of 6 months or so.
Got it.
So yeah, lots of interesting problems there.
Got it. Yeah, I think Google is a place. I'm sure that this kind of scale of problems they solve is like unmatchable, right? So the next thing I want to ask is, I'm sure I don't know if you got a chance to directly work with like the legends like Jeff Dean or like people of that sort, right? I think who have built, I think the infrastructure behind, I think a lot of us, what you do in internet, right? So one thing I want to ask is, I think apart from the technical skills, right? I think what are some of the non-obvious things you have seen some of these people possess, right? As a senior engineers or architects. I think for the audience, right? Jeff Dean is the one I think who built, I think a lot of infra behind, which comes as a Google Cloud today, right? Right. So I think I'm very keen to understand like what are those non-obvious things which those people possess outside of the technical skills. I think the core technical skills. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think so. One thing is, that you mentioned, right? Like the scale of data that you're dealing with, and the scale, just the general scale. It's not just data, but that's just different, and that leads to a bunch of problems that nobody has faced before, at least at the time that frameworks like MapReduce came out. And so I think being in that position enabled them to, coupled with their background and their like extreme kind of expertise, help them build these amazing frameworks that pretty much the entire world uses now, maybe versions of it, right?
Yeah.
But I think the general pattern, I would say, is positioning yourself in those interesting areas, and having the skill set to solve problems in those areas. That's very abstract and general, but I think that's really fundamental to everything that flows downstream of it.
You mean the being in the place where those problems exist?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think the more concrete things I would say is like, so one general pattern I've seen is not just with folks like Jeff Dean, but if you look at the different areas of infrastructure that Google has, and it's pretty comprehensive, right? I would say, thinking from first principles, I think that pattern has helped Google develop this amazing suite of like infrastructure tools. In kind of revisiting the fundamental assumptions and why, answering the question why we have to use an existing solution, why it doesn't work for the use case they have and the scale that they have. I think once they kind of started answering, looking at the problem from that lens, they figured out that, okay, you need to do something fundamentally different to solve that particular scale. So thinking from first principles, I would say, is a general pattern that I've seen in many excellent engineers.
Yeah. And I also heard a lot of stories about, I think, Google engineers having a great product sense, right? I think their ability to build, like, understand consumers and actually build products with a deep product sense, right? So, like, how do you kind of, what's your view on what level of product sense a senior engineer should have to drive the overall efforts in the right direction? Right? And how do you kind of inculcate that?
Yeah, product sense is like very key, especially as you grow more senior. You need that top level understanding of how your users are using your products. Now, I've worked on mostly back-end areas of infrastructure. So our customers are essentially other Google engineers. For the most part, at least that's been my background at Google. But even that, so there the challenges are a bit different. I mean, many of the challenges don't exist. Like, since your customers are internal, you can just talk to them easily and figure out what their problems are, and it narrows down the communication cycle quite a bit. Whereas if you're working with an external enterprise customer, the lead times are much larger, and typically you have to go through your product folks or marketing folks and stuff like that. But I think having a key sense of that of how your users are using a product will enable you to understand their problems, come up with better solutions. If it's an existing problem, or identifying new solutions, new problem areas, and coming up with solutions. So that's very important. Yeah.
Got it. I think switching the gears towards, I think you talked about kind of preparing yourself for interviews, right? So specifically different than preparing yourself for doing good work, right? So I think based on your experience of interviewing with these kind of companies in the past, I know it's like 8 years back, and I'm sure you're taking a lot of interviews, right? Could you just kind of walk us through in terms of the high level thought process and kind of rounds, and how does it go in a typical internet company for a senior software engineer roles?
Yeah, I would say, typically you would have like 3 rounds of coding, coding related rounds, and then 2 system design rounds. That's pretty typical for at least, starting with senior. The coding rounds are what you would expect, from things like lead code, not exactly, but the spirit of the problems, right? It's very similar. So those, since they are more structured, as long as you have a good algo background, you've taken a algo or data structures course in your undergrad or master's, I think you should have the fundamentals to solve that. And after that point, it's just a matter of like putting the hours behind it and getting the mileage, and just crunching through as much conscious practice as you can. System design is a little bit more unstructured, meaning it's typically based on something that you've already worked on, you're familiar with. So you're expected to have, when you're applying for a senior role, you're expected to have some kind of background in building systems. So and the system design rounds are typically based on something that you already know, or it's very general, like general core distributed systems. So yeah, I think having abstractions or those basic primitives of core distributed systems, like what kind of database do you want to use, or what kind of messaging system you want to use, what are their trade-offs, why would you use one system versus the other, having the knowledge of those trade-offs, that is very helpful when you go into a systems design round.
Got it. So typically, what amount of focus goes into kind of low-level design aspects like schema design, or kind of getting into the API design aspects, and what amount of effort goes into high-level design aspects in the preparation versus even the expectations?
Sorry, could you say that again?
From expectations perspective, right? So when you talk about system design, right, what amount of focus goes into kind of low-level system design aspects like schema design, API design, that level, right? Or versus the high-level design aspects primarily from the interview focus perspective. Yeah.
So if you think about interviews, right, they are time bound.
Mm.
So it's 45 minutes. And so if anything, you should at least try to get the high level design kind of done, right? Talk about the different blocks or building blocks you're using in your overall system design. What database do you use? I mean, at least in terms of enough blocks so that you can explain the workflow end to end. And I would say the last 15 minutes, last 15 to 20 minutes, you can go into details about different parts of the design. Like, for example, the points that you mentioned about API design, schema design for the database, and things like that you can go into afterwards. But I would say start with the simplest kind of high level block diagram of block level view of the different things in your different areas in your design.
Got it.
At a minimum, I would say get that done. In terms of expectations, I think you're expected to like go into some level of detail to a core component of your system design that is related to the problem. For example, you know, if the problem is related to scale, I think it's prudent to concentrate on, once you have the high level design worked out, it's important that you spend a little bit of time on the scaling aspects of it. For example, can your database scale to the QPS that you're required to build the system for, right?
Got it.
And things like that.
Got
So it depends on the problem.
Okay. I think you mentioned about like a lot of the system design rounds are typically based on kind of the systems you manage or you build, right? A lot of times we'll say, I think you are in networking world, right? When you go for an interview, is it mostly about the systems you worked on, or it's a lot about general distributed system concepts and hypothetical questions like a build a Twitter, build an Instagram?
Yeah.
Like how do you kind of think about those kind of questions and problems?
Yeah, so I think, like I said before, the core, some of the core distributed system primitives you're expected to know.
Got it.
You might not have worked on the exact version or exact question per se. But I think taking those building blocks of these in these distributed systems and using it to solve this particular problem, I think that is what they're looking for. In some cases, if you're going to a very domain specific role where you've already worked on, and that's what they're looking to, and the team that you're applying to in the new company is also in the same domain. In those cases, typically the questions are much more focused on the intersection between what you already know and what they're looking for.
Got it.
But in a more general case, if you're applying for a more generalist kind of senior developer role, it's typically a general distributed systems problem for system design.
I think the coding and the problem solving preparation, I think the drill is kind of well known, right? I think as you mentioned, it's a lot of hours you put, right? So how do you typically think about someone preparing towards? A lot of times you may not have a lot of exposure to kind of distributed system concepts in your current work, right? You might probably would have touched some aspects of it, right? So what are the general preparation approach, at least what worked for you, what you have seen working for people?
Well, I would say start with the simplest problems, right?
Sure.
Build your confidence. I think a lot of it is mental. Like you need to have the right frame of mind, not get bogged down, you know, if you're not able to solve a particular problem. But just step through it methodically. I think ultimately what I've realized when I was practicing these coding problems a while back is there aren't actually a lot of things that you would need to know to solve the problem. Like it's how do you say it? Like if you know, going back to algorithms, right? You have certain set of core tools that you can use to solve the problem. Like for example, Depth first search, breadth first search,
Yeah.
dynamic programming and things like this, right? I think if you know those like 10 to 12 patterns or tools that you can use, most of these problems come down to some kind of clever application of that.
Got it.
So just make sure to get enough practice that covers the breadth of these like 10, 12 key patterns or tool sets. And I think if you get enough practice there, when you see a problem, your mind will automatically kind of push you towards the right tools for solving that particular problem.
I think that mostly works for someone gets to identify the pattern with respect to at least general coding problem solving, right? So typically for design, especially like in our audience, right, we have a lot of people who, let's say, have a couple of years of experience in as a software engineer, right? They've been coding, they've developed APIs, basic exposure, right? But the current work kind of did not demand them to scale it or have exposure to a lot of high-level system design concepts hands-on, right? Typically, what would you recommend for them to kind of learn some of the distributed system concepts in what manner? Right? How can they kind of learn, right? So they've been engineers. Let's say an example, they're probably developing in Java Spring Boot backend. They're doing a couple of APIs, right? They know how to develop features, but they've not got exposure to message queues. They've not got exposure to, let's say, using caching. That's not something which their current work demanded from them, right? So kind of how do you kind of suggest them to kind of pick up some of these concepts from where they are today?
Yeah, well, I think similar to the coding rounds, there aren't really a lot of core building blocks that you would need. I mean, when I say a lot, I mean variants, right? These core building blocks like database, message queues, and things like that. And like if you're building like some offline system, some form of having some form of like data parallel processing infrastructure, like let's say Spark or Flume might kick in. But as long as you are aware of these 4 or 5 kind of core building blocks, that should definitely that is, I would say, a definite must. Now, in terms of like how, if you haven't built anything there, it is challenging. But I think a lot of material that nowadays, like you have a lot of material around, just free material online that kind of give you some example questions, and there even if the solution is not obvious and if it's not known upfront, you can kind of think through doing these mock interviews on your own, thinking through the problem, and figuring out how to use these building blocks might be useful before you go into an interview. I think if you haven't been exposed at all, then going into an interview might be like a deer in the headlights kind of thing. It's very hard to think on the spot.
Got it. So I think summary here is, I think there are toolkits, there are patterns. Look for it and be clear with the concepts there, so you can build on it. Right.
Yeah, that's the best you can do if you haven't built
on it.
Using those systems before. Yeah.
Got it. In general, I think we have spent like two companies, launch teams, a startup, right? So typically, if you have to share some key learnings, right, with respect to kind of learning, right, how should someone think about learning? What do they need to learn, right? And how should someone think about, I think, managing their professional career, right? I think what are those things I think kind of you think you picked up as a perspective or an insight, right, in your journey that will be really helpful for the audience to think about, Vishnu?
Yeah, so learning is very important, like you said. Of course, the challenge here is like figuring out what to learn and what to do. And this really comes down to your interest and what you already know and what you're interested in. I think if you follow that, that usually pushes you in the right direction. I mean, for you personally, because what area works for one person might not work for another. For example, if you think about ML, now there's a lot of hype in ML, and before generative AI, there was still a lot of hope, like hype in ML, but it's just not an area that I felt challenged in the sense that there's a lot of excellent infrastructure work, but if you're looking at core ML in the sense of like if you're iterating on a particular model and things like that, trying out different model architectures, that did not seem like a good fit for me. Like I did not like that a whole lot. I enjoyed working more on infrastructure. So that's why I keep saying that, it really depends on what you are interested in. So exploring different areas and finding what works for you is very important. And once you kind of know, okay, this is the area that I want to go to, then it's just a matter of putting in the hours and talking to people who've worked in that area, and understanding what it takes to go there. And the second thing I would say is like not being bogged down to one particular area. I think it always comes down to a matter of balance, in terms of breadth and depth. Make sure you get both. Try to get depth. Depth is important, but breadth gives you that perspective as well. So that's important to develop as well. So I would say those two things are important.
Yeah, great. Cool. I think it's very interesting to understand your perspective, right? So I think we kind of almost come to the end of this conversation, right? I'll probably take a couple of questions from the audience, right, which I think are relevant, right?
Sure.
A lot of questions are about kind of interviews, right? I'm just looking at the chat. Apart from DSA and system design, what else we should focus on preparing for interviews? Is one. You want to take that?
Sorry, this is the one.
Apart from DSA, it's data sets and algorithms and system design. What else someone should focus on preparing for interviews?
Really, that's. I mean, if you're looking at generalist kind of interviews, that's really it. I mean, there's not much else. But if you're looking at a very specific domain, like ML, for instance, I think you would need a lot of. I mean, you would, for a senior role at least, you would need that working experience in that particular area. But for generalist interviews, I would say definitely just coding and system design are the main things.
I think the next question is from Google aspirant. It says, what does the future hold for new graduates joining Google? Could you provide insights into the opportunities, growth potential in profession you can expect to be part of the begin their career with company? I think in essence he's saying like, what is the opportunity for the young people joining Google now? How should you think about it? I think probably to make it a little slightly generic, I would say it could be Google or let's say any of those fan companies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, most of these companies, I would say there are a lot of interesting projects. I think especially if you're starting out your career, like you're having, either you're a new grad or, you have a couple of years of experience. I think these companies offer a lot of learning, right? Yes, these are relatively bigger companies than, let's say, if you're joining a startup, but I think the kind of diverse set of different products and infrastructure areas that these companies have is very, that's a rich ground for getting a lot of learning and building and finding out what interests you, and going deep in certain areas. I think it allows you to build that knowledge. Once you have that figured out, then doing a startup or that I think that'll be more. It might be more structured for some people, but for some people, they might enjoy just working in a startup, figuring things out as they go. That also works for some people, but yeah, so it depends on the individual. But yeah, I would say the primary thing that all these companies offer is a lot of good learning, especially if you're early in your career.
Okay. I think there's a very specific question about is it easy to switch languages if you know one language, and how much time it takes to learn a new language, a new tech stack?
Yeah, definitely. I think I started in let's see. So in Cisco, I started in C, then I did Java in Big Switch, then at Google I did C++, then I did Go, and then I did Python, and it's all over the place. So I think if you know one language, you can very easily learn other languages, and that's why most of these companies, they don't focus on, okay, you should know this language versus the other. They just focus on the concepts. Like, as long as you know one language well, that's good enough. You can easily adapt those patterns to other languages. That's the easy part, actually.
Cool. I think that's kind of pretty much we had, right? Thanks a lot for taking this time out, Vishnu. I think I'm sure our community had a good insight from you. Hope it's useful for everyone. Thanks again, folks joining us today. Thanks, Vishnu.